perfect. Good afternoon, everyone. A real pleasure to be here with you today. I'd like to thank Professor Ari Plonsky for this introduction. And it's really, as you said, actually, it's a dream coming true, right? We started that 1 year ago with this simple conversation at the Institute of International Relations, where I was, as I will be doing now, presenting this, let's say, new concept of innovation diplomacy, which I would say it's not yet a concept. It's actually a field of activity. There's more practice to it than theory. And with this school, what we aim is to actually start convincing the academic sector to reflect upon this new area of diplomacy and start developing also some studies. I mean, similarly to what has been done in science diplomacy, that we have also that start reflecting upon this also in innovation diplomacy. So I'm very happy to be here to spend my 1 month vacation partially here in my hometown, and being able to conduct this this school here at the USP, which is my alma mater, by the way. As you said, I studied electrical engineering at Poly, actually, and then I studied philosophy some 300 meters from here at FEFELESH, and did my master's on philosophy of technology. And at some point I decided to, as they say in India, to become a bureaucrat. It's not a very nice word, but still. Here I am. I mean, it's been 7 years now within Itamaraty, and 2.5 years in India, where I've been conducting and leading the portfolio of energy, environment, and science, technology, and innovation, which I would say takes up maybe 60–70% of my time there. And it's actually Brazil and India being two emerging economies, and actually it's being a quite active field, and I'll be talking a little bit about this as well. I'm aware we don't have that much time, so I will concentrate on some specific topics on innovation diplomacy. But first, I'd like to start to set the context. I'd like to start with, I can use this here, with a little bit of history of technology. So you probably know these two gentlemen. On the left, Thomas Edison, the inventor of the light bulb, and on the right, Nikola Tesla, who, among many other things, he conceived the principle of transmitting electricity through alternating current. Thomas Edison, his name is linked to many inventions, not only the light bulb, but also the motion picture camera and the phonograph. Not only because he was an inventor, but actually, especially because he was a brilliant businessman. Actually, history tells that actually 22 people before him conceived the light bulb, but his light bulb was, let's say, more resistant, had a higher vacuum inside the glass, it was more appropriate to work in a large power system. So it was the light bulb that made its way to the market. It proved to be successful. Similarly, the kinetograph, which is the motion picture camera, it was actually not invented by him, but by one of his employees, but he got all the honors for that invention. Nikola Tesla, he was a great inventor as well, but a terrible businessman. So as of today, his name is more famous than himself, thanks to Elon Musk and his electric vehicle company. And he was born in today's Croatian territory in 1856. And then he worked in Paris for precisely for Thomas Edison, one of his affiliate companies in Paris, and then moved to the US at the end of the 19th century. And he broke up with Thomas Edison at some point and started working with George Westinghouse, and that's where he conceived the AC motor and implemented the AC principle of transmitting electricity. He made a lot of money, but then he invested all that money in doing what he liked most, which was inventing, tinkering, experimenting. He experimented with the wireless bulb, he experimented with X-ray, he experimented with the remote control as well, and also he worked on his, which was one of his, actually his largest dream, which was the wireless transmission of electricity. The thing is that none of his experiments, his projects, made its way into the market, and he died as a poor man with 87 in 1943. Another interesting double here is, and I think you know them a bit more than the previous one, is Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. Of course, Steve Jobs may be the greatest personification of the word innovation. And Steve Wozniak is, let's say, the other co-founder of Apple. But he was actually the guy who conceived the first prototype of the Apple personal computer. He was the techie guy who liked to experiment with microcircuits. He liked to integrate them with peripherals. And he actually conceived that first prototype that allowed a human to interact with the screen and a keyboard. But Steve Jobs was the guy who saw this and had the vision that this could become an economic success, and actually was the motivator of for Apple coming to the market and launch and all the stories that we all know about. Why did I bring this example, two examples here? Because I would like, for the purpose of this talk and the purpose of what we are talking here as innovation diplomacy, I'd like to draw this conceptual line between science technology on one side and innovation on the other side. So Nikola Tesla and Steve Wozniak, they are the science technology guys. They are the guys who want to advance the knowledge, the understanding of certain complex systems, or to conceive new methods to make things work. And Thomas Edison and Steve Jobs are the innovation guys, the guys who want really this knowledge to come into the market and actually have an actual impact into society, into economy. So this is, let's say, the differentiation I would like to stress here when it comes to science diplomacy and innovation diplomacy, I think. And I'd like to thank the young man there for his question, because it gives actually, it's precisely what we want to stress here, the difference between these two fields. I will skip this part of the concept of innovation, maybe just mention some small aspects, because I think maybe you are a little bit more aware of that. But the concept of innovation is essentially, it's an economic term that was, let's say, brought into economic theory mainly by the work of Joseph Schumpeter at the beginning of the 20th century. And Schumpeter actually, let's say, defined innovation as the new element that would be a new element being, for example, a new product, a new technology, but also a new method or even a new material that could be brought into a certain market, a certain society, and would be able to revolutionize that, let's say, market, and bring that market economy, society to a whole new level. Essentially, that's what he, let's say, that's how he defined innovation. The thing is that, well, that was, let's say, innovation in theory, in economic theory. Starting from the Second World War, what we saw is that some scholars and also some let's say, policymakers started to think how to operationalize the concept of innovation. And the first model, let's say, to implement this was conceived, or maybe the most iconic one was conceived by the former, let's say, scientific advisor to the White House, Mr. Vannevar Bush. At the very end of the Second World War, he released a paper called Science, the Endless Frontier, where he laid out what afterwards became known as the linear model of innovation. He didn't term it this way. Actually, people who followed actually classified this as the linear model, but the concepts that he laid out, the description that he put there, actually led to people, let's say, classify this as the linear model. And basically what this model says is that innovation follows a one-way path, a very clear one-way path, starting from basic science, moving on to applied sciences, development, production, and eventually would come to the market. That model actually relied on the very ancient dichotomy between basic research and applied research. That is, let's say, the fundamental difference that was used as the base, a conceptual base for this linear model of innovation. So one of the implications of this is that there is no other source to innovation than basic research. And most of the, let's say, science policies that were developed, conceived during the 50s, 60s, 70s, were largely based on this model, focusing funding on basic research. And as I said, this has its roots in the, let's say, classical, let's say, way of thinking, classical philosophy. And this picture on the right is taken from a manual from the OECD called the Frascati Manual, that were, let's say, guidelines that were released and are still released for every 5 years approximately to guide nations in developing their science policies. And it's a bit more detailed than, let's say, the model that was conceived by Vannevar Bush, but still reflects these fundamental difference, this fundamental dichotomy between pure basic research and, let's say, use-oriented applied research. This model started to be questioned in the 80s, in the 90s, and maybe one of the most vocal critics of that model was Donald Stokes, who conceived the model that we call Pasteur's Quadrant. Basically, he used Pasteur's, Louis Pasteur research as a reference because that specific research he conducted was a research that had both goals. Actually, he had the intention of advancing knowledge, the intention of advancing, let's say, the frontiers of understanding, let's say, understanding a certain process. In his case, understanding the microbiological process. But at the same time, it was also applied research because it has the specific goal of avoiding spoilage in food and also preventing diseases. So it is a type of research that contradicts this dichotomy between applied and, let's say, pure and applied research. So he conceived that model that, let's say, in which these two different goals can eventually be combined. And so it was, let's say, the start of a larger criticism to this model that Vannevar Bush has laid out in the post-World War era. So with this, innovation started to be seen, and innovation policy started to be seen as something that actually, innovation started to be seen as something that has different sources. Not only basic research, but it can emerge from many different actors, many different stakeholders, institutions. It was a more systematic and organic, let's say, system, and that's when actually the word ecosystem, innovation ecosystem, started to be used. Maybe today the most, let's say, relevant model that, let's say, is regarding innovation that, let's say, is used and more emblematic is the triple helix model that was developed in last decade by Etzkowitz and Leidersdorf. I strongly recommend you to read this book, which is really fundamental literature in this area. And basically, I will not go into detail, but innovation emanates from the interaction between industry, university, and government. So all these, let's say, institutions have or sectors have a role to play in the innovation arena and are potential sources, and the interaction between them are potential sources of innovation. As of today, people are already talking of the quadruple helix model, which brings society as well as an important stakeholder in the innovation process. I will skip these slides, maybe talking a little bit about the government, and I think here the role that government plays is actually, maybe we can sum it up into two roles. Of course, as a regulator, by enforcing intellectual property rights, by providing fiscal incentives, and providing the rules for company formation, for corporation governance, but also as an entrepreneur. There is this classic, it's a book that was launched in 2013, but I would already term it as a classic because it's by the Italo-American professor Mariana Mazzucato, which actually states and through various examples shows that the state has a fundamental role, entrepreneurial role in creating new technologies, in creating new technology sectors. And there are various examples in this book. I think maybe the one that people know most is about the iPhone, right, or the iPod, where basically all the technologies there from the internet, from the GPS, the CD, and the touchscreen, all started with research that was largely funded by the American government. In some cases also European government as well. So government played an essential role, and without government, without, let's say, the patient funding of government that, let's say, markets are always running into having returns very quickly. Government are more patient. So that is fundamental to really conceive and bring about revolutionary, disruptive technologies. And that's, let's say, some of the examples that Professor Mazzucato brings in this book. And of course, we saw with this, let's say, concept or this, let's say, of innovation ecosystem, we saw the emergence of hybrid organizations like technology parks. Brazil actually is one of, I would say, one of the leaders in terms of the amount of technology parks that are emerging here in the country. It's really amazing how Brazil is doing well in this specific area. Innovation agencies within large universities, and incubators as well to promote and to foster innovation through startups, and also some private venture capital organizations. And as innovation started to become, let's say, a main driver of economic growth, economic development, countries have started to embrace innovation as, let's say, their main focus of national development strategy. And for this, let's say, global innovation benchmarks started to play a very important role. And maybe the most important one is, most famous one is the Global Innovation Index that is launched every year. Actually, the last report from this year was launched 2 weeks ago in New Delhi in India. It's initiative from the Cornell University in the US, together with the WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, and INSEAD in business school in France. And they basically rank countries according to their innovation, let's say, potential from inputs and outputs. So by, for example, there are several, more than 100, let's say, indexes there that ranges from education, investment in education, amount of engineers that are graduated yearly in that specific country, from the amount of patents that one country generates and all that. So that comes into this big calculus that then this, let's say, global ranking is published on a yearly basis. So as you can see, Brazil is not that doing that well, but we have progressed a little bit throughout the, let's say, if we compared 5 years ago, I think we have done some improvements in some areas. In some areas, unfortunately, not specifically because of our, this, let's say, economic challenges. And some other countries, especially China and India, have been doing quite well and progressing in this ranking. So this kind of benchmarks has also not only, you know, for countries to compare themselves, but also has been being used by policymakers as, let's say, to conceive their national strategies of innovation. Now we come to innovation diplomacy, and here is, I would call it, the newest frontier and the new theme of diplomacy. And I think here it's, again, important to stress the differences between science diplomacy, more traditional science diplomacy, and innovation diplomacy. I think they are, of course, not completely separate from each other, but in science diplomacy, as we have heard from Marga here, I think cooperation is a very strong element, where countries get together or institutions get together to work with a common goal and to achieve, let's say, a common objective and to benefit from this objective. In innovation diplomacy, of course, the cooperation element is also there, but I think the national interest, the strategic interest is, I think, more important here. So countries using their diplomacy, using their diplomatic apparatus to try to increase their capability to innovate. It's a little bit of, you mentioned about maybe soft diplomacy, hard diplomacy, and that would be maybe a little bit more towards hard diplomacy, but I think the, let's say, nationalistic strategic component is very strong in innovation diplomacy. And one of the, as I said, it's a new area. I think our Inside School is, we can maybe say it's a pioneering exercise to reflect upon this. And what we can say is maybe some list here, some activities that have been traditionally performed or perhaps more recently performed by ministries of foreign affairs or Ministry of Science Technology, by universities, by industries that maybe could be grouped within this big umbrella of a new umbrella of innovation diplomacy. So focus in high-tech trade. We've been listening a lot about the trade war between US and China, and I think the main element here is high technology. I think that's the, at the end of the day, that's I think the main issue at stake. And also investment, but a specific type of investment, attracting investment in R&D. In our school, we'll have 2 panels actually dedicated to discussing how countries and also companies view investment, R&D investment abroad. International technology transfer, also another important topic, essential topic that I would include inside also innovation diplomacy. Internationalization of tech companies, and I think here a lot has been done maybe in the past 5 years with regards to internationalization of startups. Brazil has a very strong program in that. Our embassy in New Delhi has also a program, and so it's been, and many embassies and foreign ministries around the world has, let's say, concentrated a lot of effort in this aspect. Capacity building and mobilization of human capital. I think that's also important. I'll talk a little bit about the experience of India in that regard, which I think could be used as a reference for other countries. And of course, as I said, the cooperative, let's say, element is also there. So partnerships, fostering partnerships between national and foreign companies and institutions is also, let's say, part of what I would call an innovation diplomacy. When it comes to R&D investment, as I said, I mean, I'll bring some examples here because I think it's how I can best show how these, let's say, how things have been, let's say, how specific, I think by bringing specific examples, I think it's easier to show what innovation diplomacy actually is. So I think when it comes to attracting investment in R&D, Ireland is let's say, one of the greatest examples because foreign direct investment is one of the 3 pillars of Ireland's innovation strategy. Apart from, in addition to fostering entrepreneurship among Irish nationals and also enhancing the capability of R&D in universities. So why and how has Ireland been able to be, let's say, a front runner in attracting R&D investment? As of today, many companies like Google, Facebook, Dell, many countries have, let's say, global R&D centers in Ireland. Of course, because of fiscal incentives, that's essential. But I think the country has made a very important effort in capacity building, in making sure that there would be, let's say, trained engineers, trained scientists that could be employed by these companies, by these multinational companies, and so as a, let's say, this was seen as strategic because this would provide, in one aspect, higher quality jobs. So the local population would, let's say, benefit from this highly paid jobs, and also it would increase the potential of spillover within the economy by bringing this, let's say, R&D centers from big companies. And by fostering interaction between small and medium enterprises, local enterprises, and these big companies, the country would encourage spillover of technology. And some of these, let's say, new technology that would come into the market, into Ireland, would be, let's say, adopted and be further developed by these local companies. And of course, Ireland is not a big market; it's a rather small market. So it had to also to set up an environment that would be, let's say, export-oriented, that would encourage exports and would make the life easier for these companies to export their products and their technologies. We'll have in the school also one representative from one of the agencies, actually the Irish investment agencies, IDA Ireland, in one of the panels that will also be discussing a little bit about this experience. Then, of course, international technology transfer. And here I think it's important to differentiate between technology transfer and international technology transfer. In theory, it's basically, technology transfer is transferring knowledge that was from the place it was conceived, it was developed, to another place, and international technology transfer is when this process occurs cross-border. But in practice, technology transfer has been commonly referred as the process through which, for example, universities or research institutes would sell their intellectual property to government, to two companies, and these companies would take on this knowledge, develop it further, and then bring it to the market. International technology transfer in practice actually has a much wider, I would say, meaning. And in a diplomatic, let's say, fora, it has been used quite differently depending on the stance of the country that is transferring the technology and the country that is receiving technology. So many developed countries in many fora tend to classify international trade, the simple trade of technology, selling AI software or equipment, machinery to another country as technology transfer. Mere trade as would be classified as technology transfer. And also they tend to classify when one multinational company decides to invest or open up a manufacturing plant in another country, that would also be classified as technology transfer. Yes, that can be maybe seen as a technology transfer, but I mean, some developing countries have actually called for a much more, let's say, further, let's say, step of technology transfer, which would actually mean that the transfer of technological capability. So in which we would include the transfer of, for example, when one company decides to open up an R&D facility in another country. So you're not transferring just the know-how, how to produce a certain technology or how to, let's say, adapt it to local specificities, but also you would transfer also the ability to understand and to enhance, to develop further that technology, to absorb, let's say, this knowledge in a more complete way. So that's a kind of a struggle that we as diplomats see, because, for example, I can give you a specific example within the G20. In, let's say, I think 3-4 years ago when China was in the presidency of the G20, so we started to develop, let's say, a paper that would eventually result in an innovation, let's say, strategy for the G20. And I think one of the more challenging topics, and actually in there we had really a north-south divide in that discussion, was precisely on the technology transfer. Because the meaning that developed countries would like to, let's say, they would restrict the meaning to basically selling technology or transferring, mostly transferring, let's say, or let's say investment in manufacturing, and that's it. Whereas developing countries would actually call for a more ambition, a more, let's say, wider, let's say, concept of this international technology transfer. So, and here, when it comes to this third meaning of international technology transfer, I would like to bring some, actually two examples that I think are very interesting and can serve as a reference to other countries. One is the Norwegian oil and gas industry. Up to the 70s, Norway wasn't known at all for oil and gas. Not a single drop of oil had been pumped out of the Norwegian continental shelf. It started production in 1971. Of course, Norway didn't have the knowledge to do that, so it relied on international companies, specifically British companies, to, let's say, start extracting the oil. But the concessions that the Norwegian government made to these companies were conditional on R&D contracts with local universities, local Norwegian universities, and also with a new state company now called Equinor that was created by that time. So with the years, Norway started to develop its own, let's say, industry, oil and gas industry. Today it has investments in not only in Norway but in more than 30 countries abroad. It is a technology leader in offshore platforms and also oil drilling. And that investment also created other markets. So spillover was also there. So thanks to the oil and gas industry, Norway developed its, let's say, naval industry, and also I just got to know an interesting example of a startup that is one of the leaders in charger of electric vehicles. And that startup started actually developing chargers for oil drilling machinery that was employed in the Norwegian oil and gas sector. So Norway benefited a lot from this, and I think it's an interesting example of how international technology transfer happened through a very specific, a very targeted, and a very well-made foreign direct investment strategy. The other example that we also will have a panel dedicated to this project in our school is the SAAB-Embraer Grippen project. That was, it's a deal between the Brazilian Air Force and the Swedish company SAAB. And it involves the procurement of 36 fighter jets, but it's not simple procurement. It involves technology transfer. So there are 5 Brazilian companies that are involved in this, and these companies together with SAAB will eventually be able to develop some of the components of these fighter jets, and a whole new model of fighter jets, 2-seaters, will be developed thanks to this agreement, and will be entirely developed in Brazil, will be produced in Brazil. So this means that there are Brazilian companies, Brazilian engineers that are actually acquiring these technologies and are the ones who will be eventually building on and enhancing this technology, will eventually own these technologies as well. So I think it's also a great example of technology transfer. Another aspect I mentioned quickly is the internationalization of tech companies, and here specifically of startups. We've seen in the past 3-4 years the emergence of missions of startups that, let's say, would like to explore a foreign market. We have some companies, specific agencies in Brazil that are performing this kind of, it's also a business because they sell this kind of visits, the agenda. So, and this can, let's say, vary from simple visits. So there is a group of startups that go to a foreign market, for example, in this case, to China. They spend 1 week or 2 weeks there. They visit high-tech companies, universities, research institute there, and get to know a little bit about the local environment. Then there is, let's say, a more advanced version of these, which I would call innovation missions, that then are organized by government agencies. Our embassy in New Delhi does that as well, where we have actually a cycle, a whole process, which start with a preparatory process where we select some startups that have interest in entering a foreign market. We prepare them. We start to establish some connection with local stakeholders remotely, I mean online. We prepare them about the, let's say, the foreign market, and then we eventually bring them to that foreign market. We have specific targeted sessions, one-to-one, let's say matchmaking sections, and then there is a follow-up where we are really making sure that this, let's say, missions have a concrete result and actual business results from these missions. And more recently, I think the further evolution to that is the cross incubation of startups. So basically, we are encouraging incubators or technology parks to engage with incubators, technology parks from other countries, and to promote exchange of startups. And that could eventually mean that those startups would stay a little bit longer, 1 month, 2 months, interact more in detail with the, let's say, have a stronger interaction with the local market, and would use that time as well to adapt their solutions and products to the local market. So this is being, for example, now being promoted within the BRICS. So we, in beginning of this year, we have launched iBRICS network, which is basically encouraging technology parks, incubators, accelerators from all BRICS countries to come together and to promote this cross-incubation exercises. And the first exercise would actually be implemented in India, between India and Brazil, towards the end of the year, where we are, in a first phase, bringing Brazilian agritechs, or let's say sending Brazilian agritechs to India. It's actually, agricultural sector is an important sector for both countries, but in Brazil the sector is more mechanized, it has more technology, so it makes sense to bring them to India. And in the second phase we'll have some interesting Indian agritechs coming to Brazil and also spending some time here to know the market. So this is also, let's say, one of the tools, one of the functions of innovation diplomacy. Mobilization of science technology diasporas, I think that's also another important topic within innovation diplomacy. Traditionally, we have seen the, let's say, immigration of scientists, engineers as, let's say, it has been traditionally termed as a brain drain. It was really seen, especially from those countries from where the scientists are coming, seen as a very negative phenomenon. And that would eventually benefit only the receiving country. And we have also very interesting examples, for example, in Israel, where there has a massive migration from Russia and Ukraine scientists to Israel in the 90s. And I think part of the reason why Israel is seen as the startup nation is precisely because it has managed to benefit from the knowledge that came from these immigrants from Russia and Ukraine. But I would like to stress and highlight the example of India, which I think is where, let's say, brain drain can be seen as also a positive thing, and the diaspora abroad can be seen as a valuable asset. So the Indian IT industry is known worldwide. It exports $100 billion on a yearly basis in IT services, and 80% of that goes to the US. And the reason why the US is that, let's say, the preferred market, or let's say the largest market, is precisely because the fundamental role the Indian diaspora has played in that, by linking, let's say, local US companies to the, let's say, IT companies in their home country. And by providing this link, managed to create that huge market for Indian companies. And you know, the presence of the Indian diaspora is really, I mean, it's it's really huge in the US. If you look at the CEOs of most of these, let's say, for some of the largest tech companies, from Google, from Microsoft, Adobe, they're all, let's say, Indian origin, born in India. Some of them even have studied in India, at some point have migrated to the US, and they are still loyal to their home country. So they also generate a lot of business for India, so the Indian IT industry has benefited a lot. So I think that's an important tool as well for innovation diplomacy. In Brazil, especially our embassy in Washington, D.C. has, in the past years, started to promote and to identify the Brazilian science technology diaspora there. It's not an easy task to really identify, because there are many Brazilians there, and it's not very easy to know where they are and what they are doing, but there are many good, really top-notch scientists that are conducting really very important first-class work, research work in very relevant universities. And I think it's an asset that Brazil has, not only in the US, but also in Europe and many countries, that I think can be better used for enhancing, let's say, our capabilities here back home. Another, let's say, tool for innovation, where cooperation plays an important role is industrial innovation cooperation. And here we have, again, I'm bringing the example of India. India created some 10 years back an agency called the Global Innovation Technology Alliance, which is an agency aimed at establishing a cooperation with counterparts in other countries to foster the development of innovative products between industries. An Indian company and, let's say, a company from the partner country. So it's, and in Brazil, Embraer, which is our company that was created in 2013, that was created following the Fraunhofer model in Germany to encourage and to invest in industrial innovation in Brazil. Started with, let's say, a national scope, and now recently has started to establish cooperation agreements with other countries. And it's one of my efforts now is to make sure that we have also a, let's say, a bilateral cooperation between GITA and Embraer to make sure that we have let's say, the development of innovative products through Indian and Brazilian companies. Finally, just want to stress some of the initiatives that Brazil has been doing on innovation diplomacy. Since 2016, we have what we call a working program of innovation diplomacy, where embassies abroad and consulates and embassies abroad are encouraged to, let's say, set up an agenda to promote Brazilian innovation abroad. So we have been using this to do workshops, to bring like innovation specialists from Brazil to other countries, and also by implementing this mission of startups. As I said, we are going to do this with Agritechs. Earlier this year in India, we had a India-Brazil FinTech conference, which is another, let's say, area where Brazil and India are particularly dynamic and lots of complementarities. And also, as I said, in some embassies where there's an important local Brazilian diaspora, the mobilization of diaspora is also an important tool. Start Out Brazil is a very interesting program that started 2 years ago. It is implemented by Apex, our investment, let's say our trade promotion investment agency. And it's also, let's say, a mission of startups, and every year it promotes missions of startups to a specific ecosystem abroad. Next one will be to Boston, and end of this year they will have the first mission to Asia, to Shanghai. And it's growing in interest, and they recently released the first report, and from, let's say, 70 startups that they have supported, approximately 50% because of these, let's say, immersion programs, 50% have managed to actually seal businesses and close businesses in these foreign markets. So it's been a very important, very successful exercise. Well, I think that's it. Thank you very much for your patience, and I'm happy to take questions as well. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Rita, and one variable that I missed in both talks actually was about the military aspect of innovation and how we have a huge military scientists and researchers working in this environment of innovation. You mentioned SAAB, and that's an example, but there are others. And it is also an area, a sector, which you have a very huge budget for research, for research and development. So I would like to know how to integrate this variable of military scientists within industry innovation and
Yeah, very important, important sector that to mention, and I think Brazil, well, the military has played, as you know, if we look at the history of technology, many technologies that we know today, let's say, stem originally from, let's say, equipment technologies that were first deployed in the battlefield and by military forces, and then eventually make it its way to the, let's say, civil part of the society. So I think it's a sector that has already played, it continues been playing an important role in fostering innovation. And in Brazil, specifically, if we look at our aeronautics industry, which is one of the largest in the world, Brazil is actually one of the few countries that have capacity to build civil let's say, civil aviation airplanes, and it started with international cooperation. Actually, if you look back before the ITA was established, it started with some exchange programs between military engineers that went to the US, to some universities there, to get to know the technology, aviation technology, eventually brought it back to Brazil, and that's how our aeronautic industry emerged. So I think it's an important sector, and to some countries more than others in fostering technology. And I think it's an essential pillar of any, let's say, innovation ecosystem.
Thanks for the question. It's really missing in both our talks, and I think it's a fundamental tension between the idea of openness and collaboration and transparency, and again thinking about the ideal values of open science versus the security aspects of it, and the of course the secrets that you can't share with the counterpart. And so I was actually going to ask you this question when you deal with a counterpart for these innovation diplomacy programs, how much plays into it the actual security aspects, and how do you avoid maybe undermining your own competitiveness? And you talked about the US-China as an example, right? So how is the balance, the tension between innovation diplomacy and also security and defending your own interest and competitiveness?
Yeah, I think there are some, let's say, technologies that are more sensitive, and are, let's say, and countries tend to protect more. I'll give another concrete example of where in the beginning of this year, I was visiting the Indian Space Agency in Bangalore in South India. As you know, India is one of the, let's say, largest and more, let's say, more important space programs in the world, because they are able to have, let's say, very technological breakthrough with a small budget. And we were there with a delegation of our Brazilian Space Agency, and basically what we wanted to engage in some technology transfer cooperation. And of course, initial reaction is of reluctance. Indians, they have really, to be where they are now, 7th of September, India is will be landing a rover on the moon. It will be the fifth, maybe fourth country to do that. So to be where they are now, it has really taken time and effort. So it's, let's say, it's quite natural that we will be reluctant. But I think, with diplomacy and, trying to maybe not being too ambitious initially, And also, we can start developing, let's say, a relationship that could start maybe with a limited, let's say, scope of cooperation, and then would eventually grow larger. I think the element of trust plays an important role here. And, you know, Brazil and India are, maybe because they're far from each other, they are, let's say, there is lots of, let's say, there are not that many issues between the countries, and I think there's lots of trust also because we are engaged in different fora. So there's already a high level of trust between the countries, but I think when it comes to really you know, going into the specific details of transferring technology, the reluctance is there. It's something that we will eventually, I mean, we may not achieve what we want in, let's say, all the technology transfer that we want, but I think, you know, diplomacy is also about reaching compromise. So you don't always get what you want, but you may get maybe 0.5% of a little bit less than what it's already an achievement. So I think that's how things work, and I think yeah, the element of trust, I think it's essential in building up and really building these truly cooperative arrangements between the countries.
Yes.